St Giles Files.
Hello, welcome to episode 6 of the St Giles Files. This week it is just me, and today what I'm going to do is introduce an object and then use that to build upon some wider ideas. Now, the object that I'm going to introduce I don't unfortunately have with me. It's currently sat in St Giles, and I don't have a photo of it, so what I'll do is describe it to you, and hopefully that will do. So, it's a piece of stone that is roughly the size of 4 fists next to each other, and it came from the outside of St Giles. Now, it's got a small floral design on it, and most of its faces are reasonably uniform, so it's a carved bit of stone, but one bit is rather more rugged and hacked off, and that's because this bit of stone was taken off about 5 years ago, and the reason being that it was part of the burn restoration, which attached stone with iron rods. Now, these iron rods have subsequently corroded, and so this piece of stone had to be taken off before it fell off. Unfortunately, a bit of it actually had fallen off and taken some of the stained glass with it. So what do you do with the hole then when you've taken the stone away? Do you try and colour a new bit of stone so it fits? Do you not bother doing any of that and just stick a new bit of stone in where the old one was? Or do you get some new mason to design a lovely 21st century bit of stone that will fit in beautifully with its surroundings but be new of its own design? Well, what we did was we just got a new bit of stone that wasn't coloured just to slot in. And I'm not delusional. I understand that this tiny bit of stone isn't actually the argument that I'm making it into, but it does work as quite a nice illustration as to what today's argument is, or what today's discussion is, in that once we have something that needs repairing or replacing, how do we do it? Do we do it by today's standards? Do we do it by the standards of the day that when it was fitted? What do we do? And I think recently we've seen this argument a few different places. For example, Notre Dame in Paris, when the spire fell down, did they go for a new spire, a new design, or did they try and just rebuild what was there before? In Scotland, we've seen it with the Rennie Mackintosh building almost twice, unfortunately, with both fires. And so the question we have to ask, I think, is, do we try to continue the skills with which these buildings were originally built, giving new students the chances to exercise their skills, or do we create new skills in preservation, in learning how to really conserve what we already have? So let's have a little look at St Giles as an example of this. So as you've seen through previous episodes, St Giles has changed a good bit. Its current iteration was built in the 14th century. And when we changed that, who decided to change it, and why did they do it, and with what perceived benefit? A good place to start maybe is the crown spire. So one would guess that the main reason the crown spire was added was as an aesthetic. It looked good. But there was also some use as a lookout tower, as the higher the tower, the higher the position is, and the more that you can see. But I wonder who decided that it needed to be done. Was it a group of people? Was it a single person? And to whose benefit was that to build a crown spire, which was popular at the time, as we've discussed, on St Giles Cathedral? Was it a prestigious thing, and everyone decided that it was prestigious enough that it needed it? Another example in St Giles is the Albany Owl. We often say that it's built because he murdered his nephew, and it was either an indulgence to make sure he got into heaven, or just something to apologise with. Here's a bit of church, sorry for killing my nephew. But why did he get to build a side aisle onto the side of St Giles Cathedral? Who decided that was a good thing for him to do, and that it was necessary? And I think, given all the legislation we currently have, would that be possible now with scheduled monuments? Could you make such a change without a good justification? So I think that the why is the easy part. People will always come up with why things should be done. But the question is, should they be done? Once we're done with the questions of why, what should happen to St Giles? Now, to link back to a previous episode, the Victorians seem to think anything and everything they fancied doing should be done. So Burns restoration, which one could say maybe should have needed to be done, so should have been done, should have been on the way. Well, listen to that episode. Chambers restoration, though, I think is more of an indulgence. It's something that he wants to do and doesn't necessarily need to do, because not only does he change the architecture, but he also changes the worship, and he decides that a Victorian style, maybe even a more Anglican style of worship is necessary. So he changes the entire interior of St Giles, going from 3 churches split by interior walls to just the one big church that you see today. And so I wonder then, is that indicative of the Victorians? They did enjoy changing things. I don't know how much this is true or more just a feeling that I have, in that it seems to be, I wonder if it's Victorian arrogance that means that they think they're at the height of society, and so they have a duty to change things to the best thing as they see them. Rosslyn Chapel being another example where the Earl at the time added a baptistry and then painted the whole of the interior of Rosslyn Chapel just to fit with the baptistry. And you'd have to wonder if nowadays we might say, well, first of all, no, don't add that. It's the baptistry, it's not necessary. And second of all, definitely don't paint everything just so it matches that. Match it to the rest of it. And I wonder if this Victorian sense that nothing is out of bounds was also seen a bit after the war, especially in the 60s and 70s, where there was some need to build in that buildings had been bombed. For example, Coventry Cathedral, whilst I know it's pretty Marmite, I think it's brilliant, really like it. I think it's really well done. But when we turn back to Edinburgh in the 60s and 70s, anyone who's glimpsed the William Robertson building, let alone used it, will know it's horrible relative to the Georgian terracing which came before. And God, the St James Centre, I mean, I wasn't planning to talk about the St James Centre, but apparently it replaced a beautiful square, and it's the only area in central Edinburgh not to have any type of listing. If I can find a good map, I'll put it up, but there's all the different colours of all the different listed buildings, and then in the top right corner there's a circle of black where nothing's listed. And not so that listing is the be all and end all, but it certainly in Edinburgh especially goes to show where you might find nice buildings and less nice buildings. But I suppose the St James Centre in itself raises a point, and the fact that it isn't listed allowed us to knock it down and start again recently. And there are countless numbers of buildings in Edinburgh that, you know, you could argue have been preserved, or there's a completely new building behind an old shell. And whilst I do agree it would be a shame to lose those buildings, if all we have left is a facade, then surely that is just a facade, which is some quite nice wordplay. But if something has outlived its usefulness, let's thank it for its service and let it go gracefully, rather than building a whole new building behind it just to keep the show going. Wow, that was a bit of a tangent there, I suppose. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, or the point I've ended up making, is whilst the Victorians and the post-war Brits weren't constrained by should, we are maybe too constrained by should. And this question of should brings me quite neatly back to St Giles, because in the 1970s, once again, St Giles was ready for a bit of a touch-up, and a famous architect called Bernard Fielding was asked to write a report which subsequently became known as the Fielding Report. Now, he concluded that to bring St Giles up to the mark, there would need to be significant structural change, including an absolute ton of digging underneath, which subsequently didn't quite happen, but happened to some extent. Now, the stained glass was an area of particular interest, because Fielding advocated that we should remove all the stained glass in St Giles Cathedral, and obviously keep it and put it in a museum or something like that. But he suggested we should remove all the stained glass in St Giles, because if we didn't, and we didn't get new stained glass, the art of stained glass would be lost forever, in that we wouldn't get new glaziers coming through the Edinburgh College of Art and such, which to some degree is true, in that when stained glass was at its pomp in the early 1900s, there was 4 or 5 glazing studios just in Edinburgh, and now there is only 1. So Fielding's prediction was right in that there are fewer glaziers now. But does it go too far? Removing all the stained glass removes the historical glass from its context. And I think St Giles has managed to come to quite a nice compromise, in that, let's say, for example, the Prophet's window, which used to be the main window in the West End, was removed in 1985 and replaced by a new window by Lafer Braidfield. The Prophet's window had degraded to such a point where you couldn't really make anything out of it. So let's replace when something needs replacing, but until that point, let's not. St Giles has had loads of new things over the years, and I think has managed to strike quite a good balance. We've had a new floor, new chandeliers, but the main structure has been preserved to ensure that we can still say St Giles is from the 14th century. And I think that is the the nub of what we're talking about. So possibly a good summary is that we should maintain what has gone before, but still leave our mark. Because if we don't, then when history, or when our great-grandchildren come to study the history, they'll say, oh yeah, all these things happened. It was built, there was war, there was the 19th century restorations, all the things we've spoken about in the previous podcasts. And then we got to the 2000s and nothing. They just kind of stopped. No changes up until the present day. And I think maybe here St Giles gives us another good example. About a year or two ago, there was some graffiti. It was pretty rubbish as graffiti goes. But we had to decide what we did, and there was various conversations as to how we should get it done. One guy just said, let's power wash it, which obviously might not have particularly done a nice job of the building. But the eventual outcome has been that we cleaned it, and then we used something called lamp black to recover it. So you would never see where it was. It was a really good job done. And then I think that illustrates that if there is something that can be easily repaired and replaced to make it look as if it was as it was, let's do that. But if we get to the point where we're spending millions, or we're spending loads of time and loads of effort just to make something look as it used to, with no real gain, and maybe at the cost of and to the detriment of new arts, then maybe we should do something new. And to take us back to church spires, I think Notre Dame should have a completely new spire. As it did after the first fire, there was a new spire design. Let's design a new spire now so we can say, look at this 12th century building. Yep, we had a few fires, and this is the result. We have this monument to human building over time, rather than just saying, we've constantly just tried to make this building look as it did when it was first built. And so if I can take you back to my stone, I think given that it was a small bit of stone on a small bit of the church, absolutely we should just replace it. We didn't colour it, and I think that's fine. But if it had been a whole part of the church, I think we have a duty to leave our mark, to say, this is the original building, but due to circumstances outside of our control, we've had to build this bit, and it's great. It's new, it's fantastic. And so if we return to the question of should, we have to consider the need. So if there is a need for a large change, then we should. But if there is no need for a large change, then maybe we shouldn't. And I think that's probably quite a nice way to end the podcast. In a postscript to that, as I was reading through my notes after having finished, I realised that I'd missed one bit that I would quite like to speak about, which is St Peter's Seminary. Now, St Peter's was a seminary built outside Glasgow in the 60s, which was built completely in the brutalist style. But it's interesting because it was abandoned and then left to fall into ruin, but now is seen as one of the most important buildings of post-war Scottish building, and apparently costs something like £60,000 a year for the Catholic Church to maintain, even though they want nothing to do with it. But because it's a listed building and a scheduled monument, they have to continue to do so. And I wonder if this is taking our responsibility to historic monuments in a slightly weird way, because it's obviously important that we keep that building as a monument to Scottish architecture, but we can't just expect a private body to keep funding it indefinitely just because we need to keep it. So the government, I think, has a responsibility to do something with that building for Scotland to maintain that piece of history. Whilst I was doing research on this, there's a really interesting video on YouTube, which I will post below this, to have a little look at St Peter's Seminary, so you can have a little nosy around and get a bit more of that argument. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting postscript to add, and maybe posed a few questions about what we should or should not do with buildings that we have built, and how we can preserve them if we believe them to be important for future generations. Right, good, thanks. Part of the reason that I am doing this on my own is some staff have been furloughed at St Giles, but St Giles is doing a great job of topping their salary up, so everyone is still being paid 100% of their salary at St Giles. But the only way we can do that is by donations. So, and at the moment, given that people can't come into St Giles, we're getting very few of them. Please, 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 if you've enjoyed the podcast, do give a small donation if you can. Thanks. Bye-bye.